2025 was another year where the world felt unstable. President Trump returned to the White House. Global conflicts dragged on, and economic pressure didn't really let up. In Japan, though, the year felt different. The Nikkei hit all-time highs. Protests erupted against the Ministry of Finance, and this year marked 80 years since the end of World War II. Looking back, there were dozens of moments that could make a top 10 list for the year. So in this video, we'll look at 5 social and economic developments from 2025 that changed everyday life in Japan and how they point towards greater political challenges. In 2025, Japan's bear problem stopped feeling like a regional issue and started to look like a national one. 2025 recorded the highest number of fatal bear attacks on record, with roughly 13 deaths and more than 230 injuries nationwide. For comparison, the previous peak was 6 deaths in 2023, and in 2016, there were only around 100 injuries. Since 2020, the trend has been sharply upward. Bears are no longer confined to mountains. Sightings now occur near supermarkets, cities, and even train stations. Reflecting how deeply the issue entered public consciousness, the kanji for bear, kuma, was even selected as the kanji of the year. The British government even released a warning to British travelers to Japan about increased bear activities. Several long-term forces are driving this surge. Rural depopulation has left fewer people maintaining forests and farmland, while automation and remote work mean more abandoned houses and unmanaged land. Climate change has disrupted acorn production, pushing bears to roam farther in search of food and into human settlements. At the same time, Japan's hunter population is shrinking and aging, weakening the country's ability to respond quickly. The government's 2025 response went beyond firearms. Officials approved a broader package focused on prevention and damage control, such as expanding box traps. Funding to local governments was increased through subsidies and special tax measures, making it easier to pay for equipment, personnel, and emergency responses. The state also pushed to recruit and train more so-called government hunters and stepped up public awareness campaigns. There are limits. Although the self-defense forces were deployed to help set traps, their role was restricted. Under Japan's constitution, the SDF's mission is national defense and disaster response, not wildlife control, and they cannot use firearms against animals. A separate legal revision in September 2025 allowed hunters to shoot bears in urban areas during emergencies, but participation remains voluntary. Civilian hunters can always decline, leaving Japan still reliant on a system under growing strain. In that sense, Japan's bear problem in 2025 wasn't just about wildlife. It reflected a country grappling with depopulation, an aging workforce, and the limits of how much the state can actually do when long-term structural problems finally collide with daily life. In 2025, rice prices in Japan became a central economic and political issue, exposing long-standing tensions in the country's agricultural policy. Retail prices for a 5-kilogram bag of rice climbed well above 4,000 yen, roughly double the level seen just a few years earlier. Because rice remains Japan's staple food, the price shock was felt by nearly every household. Even when the government took the rare step of releasing bichikomai or stockpiled rice, the impact was limited, and prices barely moved. Although rice prices dipped to around 3,500 yen during the summer, by September, average prices had climbed back to roughly 4,300 yen. The instability in Japan's rice markets reflect both climate and policy pressures. Global warming has already made rice production more volatile. In 2025, a historic heat wave prompted wholesalers and dealers to purchase rice at higher prices. While total rice production exceeded the previous year's level, fear of future shortages helped lock in high prices across the distribution chain. In August, the government shifted its rice policy toward encouraging increased production after acknowledging that previous supply expectations had underestimated demand. But structural constraints in the agriculture sector, including an aging farming population and limited water resources, will make it practically difficult to increase production. Politically, proposals such as the okomeken, or rice vouchers, were floated as a way to cushion consumers from rising prices. However, these measures largely address short-term affordability rather than the deeper structural problems behind price volatility and supply issues. As Japan grapples with climate risk, an aging agricultural workforce, and long-managed production systems, rice prices in 2025 became less about a single bad year and more about the growing fragility of a food system once considered stable. In 2025, trade friction between Japan and the United States of America surged into the spotlight as tariffs once again became a political and economic pressure point. A new tariff framework announced in the spring and formalized in midsummer saw the United States impose a 15% baseline tariff on many Japanese imports, including automobile and parts. Originally, a 25% tariff on vehicles was floated around, to which Japan's government strongly opposed, with chief negotiators arguing that Japanese automakers make millions of cars in the US and employ large numbers of American workers. Tokyo also faced pressure to open its own markets to the US agricultural and industrial goods, and negotiations included commitments to increase US rice imports within Japan's tariff-free quota and expand access for US automobiles and other products. Additionally, Japan agreed to a historic $550 billion investment commitment in the United States. By the fall of 2025, while tariffs had not dramatically reversed Japan's overall trade relation with the US, this event served as a reminder that even close allies are vulnerable to America's policy priorities. The political fallout also became a talking point domestically, with critics of Prime Minister Ishiba suggesting that his leadership faced scrutiny, in part due to how negotiations were perceived. While the core trade agreement helped stabilize the situation, broader questions about Japan's export dependency and bargaining leverage remained unresolved. In late 2025, Japan-China relations entered one of their most tense periods in years, sparked by a comment from Japan's new Prime Minister, Sanae Takaichi, during a Diet session in November. Takaichi said that if a conflict over Taiwan involving China were deemed a survival-threatening situation for Japan, Tokyo might consider exercising collective self-defense. Beijing reacted sharply. The Chinese government condemned the remarks as a violation of the One China principle and a challenge to the foundational framework of China-Japan diplomatic ties, demanding that Tokyo retract them and reflect deeply. The diplomatic fallout went beyond statements. China urged its citizens to avoid travel to Japan, citing safety concerns amid the dispute and advising tourists and students to reconsider plans to visit or study there. Prime Minister Takaichi sought to de-escalate the situation, clarifying on December 3rd that Japan's official stance remained consistent with the 1972 Japan-China Joint Communiqué, which recognizes the One China framework. Despite these efforts, high-level talks between both governments had made only limited progress by year's end, with Beijing characterizing Japan's attempt to soften rhetoric as insufficient and continuing to publicly express that it absolutely does not accept Tokyo's position. Domestically, the incident produced a mixed political response. Public opinion in Japan did not broadly demand a retraction, and Takaichi's comments resonated with voters concerned about regional security. However, many in Japan's business community warned that strained bilateral ties could undermine vital economic links, emphasizing the importance of sustained dialogue and cooperation with China. As 2025 closed, the tensions remained unresolved, leaving Japan-China relations in a period of cautious engagement. In 2025, the Democratic Party for the People scored a major political win. Despite not holding a parliamentary majority and choosing not to enter a formal coalition with the ruling Liberal Democratic Party or the LDP, the DPFP succeeded in pushing forward two of its core policy goals: relief from gasoline taxes and raising the income tax threshold to 1.78 million yen. The DPFP's central slogan, Tedori o fuyasu, or increased take-home pay, became more than a campaign message. Rising gasoline prices hit households hard in 2025, especially in rural areas, and also pushed up food prices through higher transportation costs. Japan's gasoline price structure includes multiple layers of taxation, including a long-criticized temporary or provisional tax. This gasoline provisional tax, known in Japanese as Sante Zeiritsu, was originally introduced in 1974 as a temporary measure but remained in place for decades. Its abolition, effective December 31st, marked a significant fiscal and political victory for lawmakers pushing consumer relief. The party's second major achievement also came in December. On December 18, the DPFP and the LDP agreed to raise the income tax exemption threshold to 1.78 million yen, up from the long-standing 1.03 million yen level. That threshold has effectively been frozen since the 1990s, even as wages and living costs rose, pushing more workers into higher tax burdens. The revision is expected to return a sizable amount of yen per household per year, depending on income level, and is widely viewed as a tangible form of tax relief for working households. 2025 demonstrated that even without governing power, a mid-sized opposition party could still shape national policy. Together, these policies marked concrete progress for the DPFP's economic agenda. While they broadly aligned with Prime Minister Takaichi's more expansionary fiscal stance, they also raised concerns about public finances. The gasoline tax measures are expected to reduce government revenue by around 1.5 trillion yen, while the higher tax exemption could cut revenues by roughly 700 billion yen. Supporters argue the trade-off is justified to protect household purchasing power, while critics warn of inflationary risks and the political difficulty of reintroducing taxes once they are removed. None of these events on their own explains where Japan was headed in 2025. Barren cities, rising rice prices, trade pressure, and fuel taxes were all experienced as everyday problems. But as these pressures accumulated, they began to shape how voters, parties, and leaders responded. And by the middle of the year, those responses were no longer confined to policy debates. They started to show up in elections and power struggles. So in the next video, we'll review 5 political events where 2025 became a turning point for Japanese politics.